One of the very first Robin Hood books I ever read was by Henry Gilbert and involves a sort of quasi-fantastical scene in which Robin and Marian spend the night in the underground home of a family of short-statured people who live away from the big people and have a knack for disappearing from sight into the wilderness. One might be tempted to say that Gilbert was cribbing from Tolkien by introducing a hobbit hole into his Robin Hood story, if it weren't for the fact that Gilbert's novel was published 25 years before The Hobbit was. However, regardless of any halflings that may or may not have been running around in Sherwood Forest, as we're about to learn, the notion of underground and cavernous dwellings in and around Nottingham is anything but far-fetched. Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. From archers to archaeologists, we interview subject matter experts and content creators to learn why this figure continues to endure, and consider what we can learn by examining what historian Maurice Keene called the matter of the Greenwood. While what we might call halflings don't actually feature in all that many Robin Hood stories, the idea of there being a secret tunnel in and out of an otherwise impregnable castle is practically a staple of the genre. But such things aren't always just the stuff of fiction. A 30 to 40 meter long tunnel that led from outside the castle walls to the inner bailey really did exist, at Nottingham Castle, no less. And the covert use of that tunnel had a profound impact on the course of English history in 1330, around the time when it's possible that the first Robin Hood stories were being told. But castle tunnels and cavern dwellings are just a small part of the story, as hundreds of caves have been found under the streets and dwellings of Nottingham. Dave Mooney, who is currently writing a book all about the little-known subterranean areas beneath Nottinghamshire, was good enough to join me for a discussion about the wide array of Nottingham caves and their various historical uses. We also make a connection between these caves and a character who might be considered a third-tier member of Robin Hood's band of outlaws. So, string your bow, grab a pickaxe, and join us under the Greenwood with writer and historian Dave Mooney.
Hello.
Hello, Dave. I'm really glad that you were willing to take this call. Let's go ahead and just sort of dive in, shall we? Would you introduce yourself to the podcast audience and tell us a little bit about this book that I've heard about?
Okay, good evening, or whatever time you're listening. I'm Dave Mooney, local historian for Nottingham. I've written several books about the county. And at the moment, I'm working on a book about Nottinghamshire subterranea, so things that are beneath Nottinghamshire. So I've been doing lots of investigations into various kinds of things, crypts, tunnels, and caves, because Nottingham has the highest concentration of man-made caves in the country. So,
yeah, and you got onto my radar because last month I was in Nottingham and I went on the City of Caves tour, and one of the workers there mentioned you and this book and
Yes,
passed
that's right. She's
along my
written
info.
the book, so yeah, we've been
Yeah.
working on it together. So
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, so the City of Caves tour is because there are all of these caves underneath Nottingham, and this is a thing that most people are not going to be aware of. That there is a huge amount of sandstone that Nottingham is basically built on top of. There's a giant like thrusting rock of it called the Castle Rock, where the castle had been built on top of this sandstone. And sandstone is a very soft rock. It's very easy to tunnel into. So when we're talking about these caves and tunnels underneath Nottingham, we're primarily talking about these sandstone man-made caves. Is that right?
that's absolutely right. There's no natural caves under the city at all. So the current count for the amount of caves that are there, and this only came out last month, is 924, and every single one of them is man-made. There's no natural caves at all.
Yeah, 924 caves beneath Nottingham. Now, what's kind of the range of size of each of these caves? What's the biggest, what's the smallest, and what are we expecting as sort of a medium-sized cave here?
I mean, lots of them are quite tiny. Probably the majority are quite tiny because they are pub cellars. They might have been used for storage. So these are quite small storage spaces. In terms of the largest, got a couple of big tunnels. So from the Castle Rock that the castle was built on, you've got Mortimer's Hole, and that's quite a lengthy, quite a spacious tunnel. And then you've got the Park Tunnel as well, which was designed that you could drive a coach through it to get from
Hmm.
the Park State. The Park State's a really sort of posh, swanky bit of Victorian housing. And the idea was that you'll be able to drive out of that using your horse-drawn carriage. So it's a tunnel that's big enough to accommodate that.
And about how long would that tunnel be?
How long is it? It's not massively long. It's probably, I don't know, 100 yards, something like that.
Okay.
But it's very, very high, 30 feet high, something like that.
And Mortimer's Hole, you mentioned, that is the most famous one associated with the castle. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about the story relating to Mortimer's Hole?
Well, Mortimer's Hole was an interesting one in terms of being the most famous one because it's the thing that the tour guides show you probably isn't Mortimer's Hole. There is
Hmm.
the thing that is called Mortimer's Hole is a nice touristy thing that they will take you down and tell you about. But historically, the actual Mortimer's Hole is around the other side of the castle and just comes out into somebody's garden, I think. It's not accessible to the public. But what it was a tunnel leading from the ground level up into the castle. And it was dubbed Mortimer's Hole because it was used by the King, Edward III, in a kind of coup. He wanted to discover his mother in flagrante with her lover, Roger Mortimer. And so he used that tunnel to gain access to the castle. Um, but it's not that tunnel. It's not the tunnel that the tour guides will tell you it is.
Yeah, a little bit of a counter coup with Edward III trying to hold on to power rather than have it be usurped from him, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Although I've heard conflicting stories about whether or not Mortimer and Isabel were really lovers.
Well, yes. But I think that is the received historical narrative, isn't it? That's certainly the narrative they'll give you at the castle.
Yeah, definitely. So, how long ago were people digging these tunnels in that Nottingham area? How far back do these go historically? What's our earliest evidence for habitation or use of these tunnels?
So you've got, well, a couple of things here, really. You've got the historically verifiable reality, but then you've also got the belief. So there's a widespread belief that these tunnels are well, the caves are very, very old indeed. And especially in the 19th and for much of the early 20th century, people were trying to push that back into prehistoric times. And there was this idea that many of the caves might be sort of druid temples. They might be sort of evidence of a city of caves, that there may have been a place where lots of these things were used as dwellings and there was this whole subterranean city. We now know that they're almost certainly not that old. One of the core texts for sort of like calling Nottingham the city of caves is by a monk or a bishop called Asa. And he was writing in the year 893. And
Mhm.
Asa had been, he was the bishop of Sherborne down in Dorset. And he wrote this chronicle of Alfred's reign. And in this, he describes the Danish invasion of England. And he's looking back a few years, he's looking back to the 860s. And he describes at that time how the Danes invaded England and eventually got to the Saxon settlement of Snottingham. And in his description of that, Asser says that the Saxons called it Snottingham, but in Latin, it would be called, I've got the quote here, Specularum Domus, and then he translates that as Tigguo Cobauc in Brythonic, in the language that he would have spoken, because he was a British bishop. And from that, people have interpreted that phrase, Tigguo Cobauc, as meaning city of caves or place of caves. There's this interpretation, there were lots of caves here at that point. But actually, I think that's probably a mistranslation, that it seems to be cave singular. So I think at that point, there was a cave there. So you're looking at the 9th century, there was a cave, probably an ecclesiastical cave, because he was a bishop. Down in Dorset, he had access to ecclesiastical records. He would have been looking at those records and would have seen, oh, this is a place where there is an ecclesiastical building associated with a cave. So we know that there is a cave from that point. The vast majority of the caves are far more recent. If you move slightly forward in time, sort of post-Norman invasion, you find that Nottingham's 2 settlements, that you have what's called the historic core. So this is the oldest bit of Nottingham. And you have a Saxon settlement on one side, around what is now the Lace Market, and you have the Norman settlement around what is now the castle. And most of the caves, the highest density of the caves, are from round here. And so you can probably assume that the caves are starting to be dug from that point, from sort of the 11th century onwards. People are starting to dig the caves in earnest. And then the caves, you can map the city. And as the city expanded, or as the town expanded and eventually became the city, caves become sparser in the area of that expansion. So the caves are being dug all the way from that time, from the medieval period, right up until the 20th century. So the most recent caves that we've got are air raid shelters. So under the castle is purpose-built air raid shelters down there.
So you mentioned that a great deal of the caves are small ones, like pub cellars, but that wouldn't have been the case in the 11th century when they were starting to dig all those caves. Then, what would have been the purpose of the caves in that medieval period?
I would imagine storage. A lot of it, people digging wells. There's lots of wells, cesspits, places just to dispose of detritus and rubbish. Tanneries as you get as you move into that period. So yeah, a multitude of purposes. Malt kilns, I'm not sure when the first malt kilns start to arrive, but you got lots of caves that are used for roasting barley to turn it into malt.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So I have several more questions, but before I get to those, I'm going to ask you a few that were posed by members of the Discord community
Okay.
when I mentioned that I'd be interviewing you on this topic. So there was the question of what is the likelihood, aside from Mortimer's Hole, which is of course the famous one relating to the castle, were there any other sort of caverns or tunnels that might be associated with a use for secret passageways?
This is something that you come up against over and over again. This idea that there are tunnels linking the major buildings of Nottingham. And it seems to be almost a kind of universal myth outside of Nottingham as well. So lots of the other sort of towns that I've visited, there's a myth that there are tunnels linking the buildings. So this is a really, really popular idea. And I've even spoken to people. I was chatting to a builder a couple of weeks ago, and he swore blind that he had been down into a cellar in the Lace Market and he had walked the length of Nottingham under this tunnel and come out on the other side. And it's not true. Those tunnels are not there. You know, Nottingham has been extensively searched. And whilst there are little caves cropping up all the time, a big tunnel of that scale would have been found by now. But the myth is always there.
Yeah. I've heard James Wright talk about this a few times.
Yeah.
So what kind of is the longest sort of tunnel? And do we have any that are perhaps not connecting across the breadth of Nottingham, but do we have like any that are from just one house to another?
So the longest tunnel is Mortimer's Hole, I think. In terms of connecting houses, probably not deliberately. I think occasionally, because these are all done without planning, these are excavations that are unofficially done for the most part. and occasionally they would knock into each other, and you would accidentally get bigger spaces created. And in some cases, for air raid shelters in the Second World War, you would deliberately knock the caves together and make a big space so you could pass from one to another. So if you go to the Drury Hill Caves, which are now the City of Caves tourist attraction, you can walk quite a relatively long way around several caves, but it's not a deliberate tunnel that connects one place to another.
Now, even though there might not be this romantic notion with a lot of tunnels
Mm.
connecting one another, there is some evidence, though, that they have been used as hiding places or secret meeting places, perhaps not by druids, but by people engaged in smuggling or perhaps even by Luddites. What sort of evidence do we have for the tunnels and caves being used for as these kind of hiding places or illicit meeting places?
Again, that's a thing that you don't. I suppose by the very nature of them being illicit, you do not have much evidence for that. Certainly, some of the caves, people make bold claims for them, uh, that they may have been used as cockpits for sort of cockfighting, Luddite meeting houses. Slightly later on, I've heard sort of like rumours that there would be underground sort of jazz clubs in the 50s where people would sort of smoke reefer and do illicit things down there. Um, there's not a lot of evidence for that, but then I suppose if you were doing something illicit, you wouldn't necessarily leave a written record of that.
You wouldn't want a lot of evidence. No.
No, exactly. But yeah, I know. Again, it's something very romantic. It's like the tunnels. It's a lovely idea that there are Luddites conducting secret meetings or illicit jazz clubs. But yeah, you can't really prove that.
Now, I have gone on tours in Nottingham and been brought into large circular chambers and told that this was like a Saxon era residence. Do we
Okay.
have evidence of people living in the caves?
So there are cave houses, certainly. There are, right into the 20th century, there were cave houses. So people living in the caves, or perhaps using the caves as an addition to a legitimate house. So you would build a brick structure and then have a cave behind it. And so, yes, these were structures that people lived in. Whether they be Saxon, I think that's maybe a little bit too old. But yeah, for many centuries, people did live in these caves, but only a
Would,
small minority of them. Most caves weren't used for living in.
would the earliest evidence of that of habitation still fall in that range you were talking about, in that kind of post 11th century when we saw
Yeah, I think so.
more
I mean,
digging occurring?
from that time onwards is when you get evidence for any of the caves. It's very, very difficult to date the caves themselves because they don't have a sort of recognizable architectural style, and because they were used for so long, in many cases, evidence of previous usage will have been destroyed. And because people often use the caves to just dump rubbish in, they will be backfilled by anachronistic bits of rubbish. So it's incredibly difficult to date them at all. But yeah, I would guess from medieval times onwards, you would get rock houses, and not just in Nottingham, in other bits of Nottinghamshire where the sandstone exists, because that block of sandstone that
Mhm.
Nottingham's on, Nottingham's right at the edge of that block, and the cliff faces that the City of Caves attraction is built into, and that the castle is built on top of, they represent the very, very end of a huge block of sandstone. And if you follow that block to the north, you find in places like Mansfield or near Retford, other places where people were digging caves and living in caves themselves.
Oh wow. Yeah, I was going to ask also about how far do these caves extend and how much do we know about cave use still as you say in that block of sandstone but away from the more habited areas like Nottingham.
So yeah, it is a thing. So I was up in Mansfield a couple of months ago now, and the cave houses are blocked off, but they are still there in evidence. There were people living in them. There's photographs of them being used as habitations, and of people actually still living in them. Certainly towards the end of the 19th century, maybe even into the 20th century, people were living there. There was even a pub. There's a pub in Mansfield called the Old Lion, which unfortunately is closed down now. They did loads of work, restoration work on it, but yeah, it's closed down. But the pub was carved into the caves there. And in I don't know a couple of weeks' time, I'm going up to Retford, and there's some cave houses that are still accessible. They're on private land, but they are still. I think these are the only accessible cave houses that are left. But yeah, so there were people living there, factory workers. Again,
And
end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries.
And so when we say a cave house, would you describe a little bit about what that looks like? How big are they? How many rooms might they have? Are there like faces that are put on them with doors or brickwork? What should people expect to think
Probably
about a
something like
cave
a
house?
hobbit hole, I guess. So I think Tolkien lived not too far away from Kimber Edge in the West Midlands, where people were still right into the 1960s living in cave houses. So imagine a hobbit hole, a cottage cut into the earth, but probably with a brick building in the front of it. So you might have a bricked up front with windows installed, and then several. Just imagine a standard cottage, I guess. Several small rooms. You probably have a chimney fitted so that you can have a fire in there.
Hmm.
There's an idea that these might have been squalid quite places that's the received wisdom that these were very very poor squalid housing, but I'm not necessarily sure that that's the case, and a lot of people I've spoken to about them don't seem to think that that was the case, and that when people were forced to leave their rock houses to move into more standard accommodation, they were quite reticent to leave because people were happy as far as it goes in those rock houses. So a cozy kind of cottage, I guess.
Uh, I mean, it sounds pretty nice to me, but I've always fancied myself as a bit of a hobbit.
I mean,
So
how cozy was a 19th century cottage anywhere, you know?
So
Um,
these would be mostly in cliff face more than like underground. You would have.
yeah, I don't think. I mean, people ask this a lot when I'm showing them around the caves about people living underground, and I don't think that's a thing that you would really do. There's the questions of ventilation and damp and stuff if you do that. No, it's more of a cave cut into the face of a cliff and then bricked
Mhm.
up at the front.
And so while we've quite recently, relatively speaking, had people living in some of the cave
Mm.
houses, we still have some of these caves that are still used as pub cellars, right?
Absolutely, yeah. There's several pubs around Nottingham that are still using their pubs, still using their cellars actively, and not in a kind of showy, pretentious way. That's just where they store their beer.
Yeah, still just very practical.
Yeah.
And lots of practical, useful reasons to use the sandstone as a insulating area to keep it nice and cool, whether
Mm.
it's for your beer or your ale or for storing food, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they keep it at a constant temperature. It's about 14 degrees centigrade, I think, which is perfect for storing beer and brewing. Historically, people would have brewed down there as well. So they are perfect storage spaces.
Yeah, brewing and tanning in the City of Caves tour, we get to see the tannery that was in operation there, which
Mm.
I understand is kind of unique as an underground tannery. Is that right?
I think that's the last one. It wasn't unique for Nottingham, but it's the last one that's exists in its entirety. Yeah.
I meant Nottingham being a little bit unique in terms of having underground tannery.
Oh yes, I see. Yes, I think yeah. As far as I know, that's the case.
Yeah. And how late was that in use?
So that particular tannery, I think, was abandoned in the 17th century, as far as I know, roughly the same time as the Civil War, to the best
Hmm.
of my knowledge. Yeah, and it would have been in use from it would have been in use for about 150 years, I think. So from the early Tudor period, roughly to the time of the Civil War.
And it creates a very fun Robin Hood connection that I hadn't really thought about before taking that tour, because there's a ballad, Robin Hood and the Tanner, which was
Of
probably
course.
written in the late 17th century,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
involves Robin Hood meeting Arthur a Bland, a tanner from Nottingham. So
Yes.
you can now, being there and visiting this underground tannery, you can imagine, oh, this is where he would have been working, or where the ballad writers would have had in their mind, because of course this is the 17th century when they're writing this,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
even though it's taking place centuries beforehand.
Of course, yeah. And there certainly were tanneries a considerable date before that. The tanneries do go back sort of several centuries before that. But yeah, I actually, when I'm doing the tours, I do tell the story of Robin Hood and the Tanner. It's a nice little segue into showing people the tannery.
Yeah, yeah, it creates a really fun connection there, and you get the figure of Arthur Bland, who's one of these kind of just on the periphery of being a well-known Robin Hood figure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Doesn't show up in movies, but every now and then he'll pop up in a book or a TV show or something.
He's one of the Will Scatlocks of the Robin Hood canon. He's,
Right. Third tier or so.
yeah,
So your specialty clearly is history. I don't want to put you too much on the spot because I don't know how much this is an area that you've studied, but how much could you tell us about the geological formation that led to all there being this huge block of sandstone that Nottingham exists on?
So, I mean, this is something, obviously, as part of my research, I'm not a geologist, but as part of my research, I'm having to look into this.
Okay.
And as far as I understand it, the sandstone block that is there was formed between 250 and 200 million years ago. So you're in the Triassic period. At this point, you've got Pangaea, which is the big supercontinent,
Hmm.
and England, or the bit of England that was now Nottingham, was in the midst of a desert, sort of in central Pangaea, sort of very far inland. And there's a wide, incredibly wide, shallow river delta that is washing material down from what is now France. And it's that material that was washed down and laid up sedimentarily over millions of years that creates that sandstone. And if you see that sandstone in cross section, you often see layers of different colors. The sediment is very, very different. You can see very firm stratification in the sandstone. So, yeah, this is a Triassic period sandstone block that was created by a river depositing sediment, basically.
To pivot to another area that you're probably not a specialist in, to go from the geology to the paleontology, are fossils found in that sediment?
No, not as far as I know. So you've got sand, you've got pebbles, you've got occasional clay deposits. So you'll get little bits of clay and nothing else. So no, we're not finding any fossils in there, unfortunately.
All right. So, do you have a personal favorite cave?
Personal favorite cave.
Yeah.
Um, the most exciting one I've been in is the Middle Pavement Caves. It's probably the most exciting. The reason it's my favorite is because it's not accessible to the public. But Peter Godley from the Nottingham Historical and Archaeological Society took me down there. And this is a series of malt kilns. So three, I think, malt kilns together. They've been knocked into each other into one space. And it has wells in it. So the malt kilns, where you're roasting the barley to turn it into malt, as part of that process, they would require water. And so they had wells. And there is a well at the City of Caves attraction.
Hmm.
But the well that you view there, you're viewing from the bottom and it's been blocked off, not very far up. And to be in a cave where you can look into a well from close to the top of it and get an idea of the scale of that well, it's awe-inspiring. This is a 50-foot, 70-foot drop into pitch blackness. And what you see on the edge of the well is loads of little divots. And these are footholds and
Hmm.
handholds that people would physically climb down into the blackness to dig the well out, or later when the well was finished to clean it out. And I think just being able to look into that and get a sense of that scale and get an idea of what those people were climbing into, I found awe inspiring. So that one I loved. If I can have a second choice,
Yes,
the,
of course.
the Nottingham catacombs, I think, are incredible. So these are an old sand mine that were converted into or they made a start on converting them into a catacomb. So they built a cemetery on top of the sand mine. So sand mines are what they sound like. You would literally mine the sandstone to turn it into sand
Hmm.
that you could use for building or glass making or whatever. And as there were these tunnels already there from the mine, underneath where they were building a cemetery, they decided to convert it into a catacombs. So you've got this incredible network of pitch black tunnels beneath a really gorgeous Victorian Gothic cemetery. So yeah, I think that's an incredible place as well.
Do we know when that building project would have been? That catacomb?
1850s, I think.
Okay.
1840s, 1850s, the cemetery was put in place.
And I
Um,
really thought about the sand mining before. Was there any sort of glass manufacturing industry around Nottingham?
yeah, we've still got a Glasshouse Street where they would have, that was originally the site of the glass industry within the city. So yeah, it was a thing. So as I say, it would have been glass making, it would have been building, and also apparently they used to sell it to housewives. So the biggest sand mine that we've got is under Peel Street, and that was owned by a man called Rouse, and he made his living mining the sand and then selling the sand to housewives to use for strewing on the floor, cleaning the floors with.
And when would that have been?
Early 19th century.
Okay. It seems like there's this long use and history relating to the caves,
Mm.
but almost sort of a I don't know, Renaissance rebirth in the use of the caves in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Um, yeah, I think maybe there was a renewal of interest or a kind of discovery of these caves in that time, and people often misinterpreted what they rediscovered. I've got some wonderful quotes from a man, what's his name? Reverend George Oliver in the 1850s. And he's writing about caves under the Rock Cemetery, so the Nottingham catacombs. And he's looking at them as they're making this conversion into a catacombs itself. And he's saying, oh, there's these incredible caves that nobody takes an interest of. And I've actually got the quote here. Hang on, I'll tell you what he says. The prevailing, and indeed the only conjectures current in Nottingham, as far as I can collect, are that the structure, in common with the caves in the park and at Sneinton, together with the Hemlock Stone on Bramcote Hill and the rocks near Blideth, are that they are either of druidical origin or were excavations made by Robin Hood and his merry men for domestic purposes and rendezvous, or that they were simply hollowed out by persons digging for sand. The latter assumption is too absurd to notice, and therefore I pass over it for the present without remark. So yeah, and a lot of people seem to think these are druid.
So the Robin Hood or the Druidic use he considered more likely than the mining for sand.
Yeah, and it was a mine probably within his lifetime. So
that's pretty amazing.
yeah.
You do get that sort of thing, of course, all over that area. On my most recent trip to that part of England, I also went to Craswell Crags for the first time,
Okay. Yeah.
where they, of course, have a Robin Hood cave. You know,
Yeah.
oh, this is where Robin Hood hid from the sheriff. And they also mentioned, quite interestingly, though, they did find all of these witch marks, these atroprotraic marks that are
Yeah.
potentially for warding evil or something. I'm not even sure where something like that would have been found in Nottingham, but it's certainly something that would have led credence to the idea of there being ritual use or druidic use. Has there been anything that even hints at that sort of thing?
Ritual use or druidic use? No, I don't think so. I think people definitely interpret it as that. So there's the druid holes. They're called the druid holes, or the papist holes, or the St Mary La Roche caves. And these were interpreted quite early on. So middle of the 18th century, William Stukeley came to Nottingham and interpreted these as a druid site, and this became a tourist attraction that people came to see these marvelous druid excavations. But it's something that he was reading into it that wasn't there. And I think that's the case with all of the caves that people have associated with being of not necessarily a ritual use, because that was a ritual use, but it was a Christian ritual use, not a druid ritual use. So I think all of the caves that people see in that way, it's reading things into it.
So what was the use of those caves?
Those caves, they were part of Lenton Priory, which was a religious priory. It was a religious community. And it's probably those caves that Asa was talking about when he says Tigguo Cobauc. That's probably the cave house he was talking about. Because from quite early on, this was a religious establishment. And there are several hermitages.
I was actually just about to ask about hermitages. On my walk to work every day, I pass by an old hermitage, and I was just thinking with all of those caves, there had to be some that were used for hermitages.
Yeah, there absolutely are. So Lenton was used in that way. There's also Sneinton Hermitage, and the street is still called Sneinton Hermitage, and you can see what remains of a cave there that would have been used for religious purposes. And then eventually, those caves around it became used for domestic purposes. So they became houses, cave houses. But originally, yeah, a religious site.
What do you find that tends to surprise people the most when you take them on a tour?
What tends to surprise people the most? Um, just the fact that the caves are there, I think tends to, because this is almost a secret thing.
Right.
Nottingham's really, really bad at capitalising on things that would bring people into Nottingham and they would be interested in. So these caves are not really spoken about or sort of trumpeted about. Same with Robin Hood. I don't know if you found that when you visited Nottingham. Nottingham
Oh,
does not make very
I've
much
done
of it.
multiple episodes about this.
Oh, really? Okay. But yeah, how does Nottinghamshire use Robin Hood? It doesn't, is the thing. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think just the fact the caves are there is what
Yeah.
surprises people because it's not made known that Nottingham doesn't make a big song and dance about the fact that all these caves are there.
No, I had no idea the first time that I visited Nottingham. It's only the most recent time that I went on the City of Caves tour. And even then, I had a really hard time finding the entrance.
Oh, it is ridiculous. It used to be much more accessible. It used to be through a shopping centre. The shopping centre's gone, and the entrance is now just hidden from everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a genuine problem.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think the city could make a lot more of the caves that are there. There used to be more caves that were open for tours, and they could be made accessible again. But there just seems to be a real reticence to do that for whatever reason.
Well, would you like to say anything more about your book, other resources that people could go to for finding more about the caves around Nottingham, or some of the other projects that you've been working on?
A bit about the book. So the book should be out sometime next summer. So my deadline is the 1st of January 26. So by the time it's gone through sort of proofreading and stuff, sometime next summer, it's going to be called Going Underground, Nottinghamshire. It's part of a series, so it's part of a national series. So there's already books out dealing with other counties and other cities. And it will look at the caves, but also plenty of other subterranean spaces. So you mentioned Cresswell Crags. We've
Hmm.
got various underground reservoirs, railway tunnels, crypts, all kinds of things. So yeah, that should be out probably in about a year's time. What were the other questions? I've forgotten what you asked me now.
Well, you mentioned, in general, you're interested in in history. You're a
Hmm.
historian, working in Nottingham. Do you have any other books or other works that, or social media that people might want to look at?
Oh, I've got no social media, but I've got 4 other books out if you want to look at those. So from Amberley Publishing, you've got Nottingham Pubs, 50 Gems of Nottinghamshire, Nottinghamshire A to Z, and Nottinghamshire's Literary Heritage. So if you want to check any of those out, that'd be lovely.
Oh, so you've done a lot on Nottingham's tourism.
Absolutely, yeah. And I swore blind that I wasn't going to write any more books, and then the Subterranean one came up and was offered, and I couldn't resist.
Hmm. Yeah. So I guess I asked a little bit about, largest caves and longest caves. I guess one thing I forgot to ask is how deep do these go? What is the sort of depth that one would expect when we're either talking about these pubs, cellars, or the wells obviously go quite deep, but some of the tanneries and things like how deep underground are some of these?
Well, I suppose in terms of the tanneries, because they're like rock houses, they're carved into the cliff face, so they're not deep at all. It's a horizontal excavation rather than a vertical one.
Yeah, if those were
Uh,
actually enclosed, everybody working in them would just die.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, so they are at ground level at the base of cliffs. In terms of cellars and things, occasionally you'll get them so they are 2, maybe 3 stories deep. You're not talking a very long way underground, but you occasionally do get them several layers down, I suppose.
Hmm. Well, one of the questions that I always like to ask a guest, and you're clearly somebody who has given some thought to things of this nature. What is your favorite, or perhaps most meaningful to you, adaptation of Robin Hood?
What is my most favourite? Oh, is this going to be? I don't know. Are you gonna scorn me for this? I really like
No, no, no. There is no wrong answers here.
Maid Marian and Her Merry Men.
Wow.
It's
Wonderful.
I'm the right age for it. It was a joyous part of my childhood.
Yeah, it's come up a couple of times where people have
Okay.
mentioned it fondly, but I think you might be the first who really like put their stamp on that as their
That
favorite.
is my favourite, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Not an answer I was expecting.
Okay.
Um, but one that I'll be looking more at that show very soon. It's coming up very soon in sort of my rotation of looking at all the films and shows chronologically because we're just wrapping up Robin of Sherwood, and then that's kind of next on the list.
Wonderful. Is it something you've seen before, or is this going to be a fresh?
I've seen only the first episode and
Okay.
the Pancake Day song.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Marvelous.
Well, I'll need to pick out which episodes I look at, though. Do you have any favorite episodes?
Do I have a particular effect? The Whitish Night, is it called The Whitish Night? There's one where that is the theme tune. I don't know if it's actually called that, but the one with the Whitish Night in sticks in my brain.
All right. Well, I'll make sure to look that one up. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me, Dave. This has been delightful.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
And I wish you the best of luck with the book. And, I don't know, generally promoting history and tourism there in Nottingham.
I shall do my best. But yeah, thank you.
My thanks again to Dave Mooney for that informative discussion. If you ever find yourself in Nottingham, make sure to visit some of the caves that we discussed. In addition to the City of Caves attraction, there's also a cavern tour package that I considered a highlight of my visit to Nottingham Castle. And Robin Hood himself will lead you down beneath and beyond some of the old pub cellars as part of Ezekiel Bones' Robin Hood Town Tour. And speaking of both Dave Mooney and the historic pubs of Nottingham, I've added to the episode description a link to Dave's books, 50 Gems of Nottinghamshire and Nottingham Pubs from Amberley Publishing. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to help support the continued existence of this podcast, then please consider heading over to buymeacoffee.com/intogreenwood, where it's extremely simple to donate one-time tips that show your appreciation for all the time that goes into putting these episodes together. And of course, what really makes this possible at all is our supporters on patreon.com/intogreenwood. Those recurring donations, even at the $1 and $4 level, are what lets us do the bare minimum of paying for our hosting fees so that these episodes can be out there for you to listen to. Plus, there's some extremely fun bonus audio on the Patreon for everyone who is at the Merry Bandit or Notorious Outlaw level. A special shout out this episode goes to Rag for being our latest supporter at the Notorious Outlaw level, which will include a special Into the Greenwood t-shirt. Thank you so much, Rag. It's greatly, greatly appreciated. And of course, we'd be doing our guy Robin a disservice if we didn't donate a portion of all proceeds to a charitable cause. Our select charity remains Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated organization bringing sustainable food and clean water to impoverished communities around the world. If you've got a little extra cash and want to toss it at them directly, then by all means. As always, there is a link to their website in the episode description. If you don't have any extra cash, then you can still be immensely helpful to the podcast by leaving a 5-star rating, writing a quick review, or simply sharing the podcast with your pals. As a small independent podcast, every single rating, review, or share has a truly appreciable impact. Into the Greenwood can be found on Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, all with the handle @IntoGreenwood. If you're inclined to just give social media a pass entirely, then you can also reach out over email at the address intogreenwood@gmail.com. Additionally, there is an active Discord server for all things Robin Hood related, run by friend of the show, Mike Nichols. There we will organize watch parties, play games, run a Robin Hood themed book club, and generally have a delightful time. If you'd like an invitation, then just reach out over email or social media. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing you all safe travels until our next journey together into the Greenwood.